There we go.
All
Super.
right.
I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Trudy. Welcome, folks, from across the country. Before I introduce our guest speaker, let me tell you a little bit about where I'm from. I'm from Northern Virginia. I am Subasati. I'm a volunteer community ambassador with ARP here, and it's wonderful weather here, and I hope that you're enjoying the same. From our earliest beginnings, ARP has championed lifelong learning. That's why ARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April. And you can see we're winding down at 3 o'clock Eastern time for curious explorers. For more than 60 years, ARP has been a wise friend and fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. ARP has earned a reputation as a wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as a wise friend and fierce defender, ARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As a wise friend in your corner, ARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from fraud, get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun like what we're going to do today with our Tuesday Explorers program. I hope you will continue, to take advantage of these opportunities and more. Well, it's my honor to introduce Roger Schultz, a retired Lieutenant General, which means 3 stars. Roger Schultz completed 42 years and 9 months of uniform duty in the U.S. Army and the Army National Guard. Since leaving active duty, he has served in leadership positions in the private sector. His 7-year duty as the director of the Army National Guard places him as the longest serving director in the history of the National Guard. Lieutenant General Schultz is the first Army National Guard to serve at the 3-star level. In addition to the corporate duties outlined above, General Schultz has been an active volunteer. He is also a recipient of the Roy Wilkins Renowned Service Award. In 2020, he was inducted into the Infantry Officer Candidate School Hall of Fame. General Schultz completed 4 years as an enlisted soldier before graduating from the Iowa Military Academy. Roger is a Vietnam veteran, served in the 22nd Infantry, led a rifle platoon, and later a scout platoon in the 25th Infantry Division. It is indeed my honor to turn it over to Lieutenant General Schultz. Sir, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Suba. Quick audio check. How do I sound, Suba?
You sound great.
Okay, thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody. It's a distinct pleasure, a real honor for me to address you today. We're going to spend some time at the Army's Museum, but let me open by saying thanks to each of you for what you're doing, for the things that you're all part of. And as I talk with you about the museum, it's really a story about our soldiers. It's about our Army history. In many respects, it's about our nation's history. So I'm going to open with a few thoughts, a few slides, and I'm just going to talk with you at a high level about the museum and what we say and do here. And then in the course of that discussion, there'll be time later on in the program for questions, answers. So think about them as we proceed here. As you look at this slide, it's a virtual tour. You're obviously well aware of all of that. But inside the thought of exploring on Tuesday, just for sake of a reference here, you'll see the National Museum of the U.S. Army logo in the lower left corner, and you'll see the Army Historical Foundation to its right on your screen there. And the reason I make this point is that the Army Historical Foundation is a team that accepted partially designed museum details in 2015, and basically the Army gave us the responsibility to finish the museum. So from 2015 until 2017, when the construction actually started, the foundation essentially was raising money to create what we now know as the Army's National Museum. Now, there's some great stories about how the Army's National Museum came about, but in terms of just what this looks like, I'm going to take you back to 1814, and the Congress. This is the 13th Congress now. The 13th Congress said to the Army and the Navy, you need a place where you can collect, preserve, and exhibit. Think of a museum today, that's what we do. Flag standards and so on. Now this is going to be February 1814. Now the War of 1812 is actually still ongoing when this action takes place. And so if you think about this, the Congress gave the Army and the Navy, two services at the time, instructions, and they said, we'll give you $500, appropriated dollars, to create this place where you can tell your story. Now, as I make this point with you here, we're no threat to the museums across the country. We're a complement to the museums across the country. But the piece we were always missing was a place to tell the Army story, to tell the soldiers' stories. And as you think about the Army, for sake of a reference, there was no Army in 1774. The Army came along in 1775. We didn't have a nation in 1775. And so as we tell you the Army's story here, stories of our soldiers, we're talking about our nation's history as we proceed. So $500 appropriated. And well, you can say it's kind of taken a while for you, Roger, to get this thing started, but we have it now. And just for sake of reference, the Navy is also creating their National Museum in District of Columbia as well. Okay, so here's what we started with. And you say, wait a minute, that looks like a golf course. And as a matter of fact, there are 5 fairways, 5 greens on this aerial photograph. And that's where we started. The Army studied 64 sites and finally came down to Fort Belvoir as the location. And so what we had to move just a few trees. You'll see that from the display here, move a few trees down in the kind of left center of this photograph. But this is what we started with. So the Secretary of the Army called General Bill Hartzog at the time, who was the chairman of the foundation, said, hey, General, if you want to create a museum for the Army, by the way, you have to pay the Army $3.5 million to move those 5 golf holes, golf course fairways and holes. So that's what we did. And that's how we got started. So that's our start point right there in that slide. And here's what we have today. Just for reference, you'll see it in the upper view on that photograph. You'll see some water up on the horizon. That's the Potomac River. So if you think about District of Columbia, we're 20 minutes south of the District of Columbia on Route 395. So Route 95, major north-south corridor. Many of you are familiar with that. Route 1's a major north-south corridor. We're halfway between those 2 traffic corridors with a spot that is 6 miles from Mount Vernon. But just to give you a reference, that's essentially where we are today. You'll see the museum in the background. You'll see a parking lot for 700 plus vehicles here. And I'm just going to take a few minutes and walk you through this story here about this special place. Now, when I talk with you about last week, this is a view from last week because today the sod's all down. And just in the last week and a couple of days, we've actually finished resodding here and major construction, creating Warriors Field here. And on the 10th of June, just a few weeks away, we're going to have the Army's birthday out here. Now, technically, the Army's birthday is on the 14th of June, but the scheduling and so on in Washington around that June 14th week is pretty busy. So we'll have a major event here on this field. So you say to yourself, okay, so what's the purpose of the field? Why would you create this anyway? And the answer is right here. We want to connect with the public. We want to tell the Army story. We want to tell soldier stories. We want to expose those visiting members of the communities more about our Army. We want them to get to know our soldiers. And so that's what's going on here. You'll see a twilight tattoo. This is where we have the old guard on display, fife and drum corps on display, have Pershing's own band. And this is a special place where you get a chance to learn more about the Army through the talent and tremendous professionalism of the soldiers in these units. And so this is a way that we connect with the public. And so we talk about reunions, retirements. We practiced with the 1812 overture. You're familiar with the 1812 overture, where they fire the cannons in synchronous with the music and so on. Those are the kind of events we're going to have out here on Warriors Field, and really just in a couple of weeks we'll have this ready for our visitor. Okay, so this is the museum today. Our mission is to honor the American soldier by telling their story through the U.S. Army story. And as you just think about our Army since 1775, there's something on display that's really unusual. It's evident as you walk through the exhibits and study the stories of our soldiers, and it has to do with the courage of the American soldier. Just think about this. They set their lives aside. Essentially, they take an oath and say, I'll do whatever you ask of me. I'll obey the orders of those appointed over me. And that's the nature of service in any branch. And in the case of our Army today, soldiers take that oath. And they've taken oath very, very similar since the beginning of our Army. Well, you look at this building, and this is the structure as it exists today. There are 185,000 square feet in this building. The exhibit hall essentially is on the left as you look at the slide there. But you notice the steel, the reflection. You get close to the building, and the building actually changes appearance. It changes color. And so the facade will be, it'll be a dark and light. It'll be blue, be yellow. And so the point is that the steel is a reflection designed intentionally to create a reflection of the strength of our Army. Or you could say that it's created to represent the strength of our Army and the diversity of our Army. And so all of these things in terms of symbolism, they all have meaning. So here's the museum. I want to take you inside now. We're just going to walk through some of the features that we have inside this special place. And one of the things, as you talk about, some already visited our museum. One of the things that we did is meet soldiers from our Army's past in the 1700s, 1775 in particular. Early on, of course, we had First Commanding General. We had a number of militia units that were mustered from the Northeast, Boston area in particular, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and these states then actually contributed to the formation of our Continental Army. Now, when you think about that, just for a second, just think about this. Those units were all necessarily not equipped well. They weren't trained well. In some cases, they weren't even well led. And so we took that collection of volunteers basically and called ourselves the Continental Army. What a story. What a story about our First Commanding General and the leaders that served in those periods. So I'm struck by the significance of what each of those actions meant. And it all starts with an individual soldier. So the first soldier you see here is from the Revolutionary War. The second soldier you see there is from the Civil War. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about those two soldiers as an example, because these soldiers invite our guests, invite our visitors into the museum. And here they are. October, I'm going to take you back a couple of years now, October 1781. This is in Yorktown. This is the final assault on the British positions in Yorktown. And Alexander Fish, Nicholas Fish, actually led this mission. 400 soldiers, infantry formation. He worked for Alexander Hamilton. And so when you think about a battalion today, a battalion of soldiers is about 400 soldiers. So Nicholas Fish led that final attack on the British. Had a small team of sappers that precluded the initial assault, and they enabled then ultimately the assault on that British position. General Washington was determined to have the enemy surprised by the attack. So picture this for a second. These are soldiers that are hardened. They've been fighting for years. General Washington's instructions to that unit was do not load your muskets. Just capture that thought for a second. And so they made an assault. These are the Continentals now. They assaulted the British positions with just their bayonets fixed. Limited visibility attack. And by the records that I've been able to look at, that looks to be the attack lasted less than 15 minutes. It was that significant in terms of surprise. So that's Nicholas Fish, Revolutionary War. The soldier on the right is William Kearney, Sergeant William Kearney. Now I'm going to give you a little history here, just so everybody's got a reference. The thought, prevailing thought back in the day, this 1860s now, was that African Americans, they called them colored troops back in those days, but the African Americans didn't have the courage to fight. And William Kearney, Sergeant William Kearney, from the 54th Massachusetts, is a soldier who proved all of those thoughts, those prevailing attitudes across society wrong. Quick story. Kearney sees the color bearer. These are the national colors they're carrying now. He sees the color bearer is wounded, and Kearney himself wounded. He lays down his weapon and picks that flag up. And in many respects, the flag was a rally point for units back in those days, because that was a communications platform for units, because that's really all they had other than hand and arm signals. So William Kearney drops his weapon, picks up the flag, later said, boys, the old flag never touched the ground. For his actions at Fort Wagner, this is 1863 now. For those actions, he received the Medal of Honor. His Medal of Honor was determined and presented 37 years later. So two soldiers, you meet Nicholas Fish, Sergeant William Kearney. Just a couple of examples, because these are the soldiers that welcome our visitors into the museum. I just want you to get to know them a little bit. Okay, now we're inside the museum lobby, and you'll still see the soldiers on the pylons. And so the idea is you meet the soldiers from the Revolution, and then you meet soldiers from across our period of Army history. Then as those soldiers then welcome our visitors into the museum, then you see a platoon formation made up of soldiers from our Army past. And the significance of this is they're all different. We have people come in our museum and say, how did you pick the individuals? Just think about this. We had 30 plus million serve in our Army. How did you pick 41 stories? And the answer is, you pick soldiers who represent the strength of our Army. Now here's my point with you here. That is, the strength of our Army in many respects comes from our differences, comes from our willingness to work together, comes from an interest in improving who we are by sharing responsibilities and sharing duty. And every day is not perfect, and the Army in all cases didn't get this right. As Suba mentioned, 40 plus years in an Army uniform, and the one thing that we always want to do was make the Army better tomorrow. And if you're committed to that, then you'll change your attitude. You'll change your thoughts about others around you that don't look like you, or perhaps that don't think like you. And so what I'm offering, just for thought now, this is my own personal approach to how I guide these tours, and that is there's a strategic value in that platoon formation represented in this museum. What's the strength of it all? Every one of these faces different. Unbelievable strength in our formation without any question. Okay, notice in the ceiling. You see the green and amber and red ribbon up in the ceiling? That's the Vietnam War. The blue, United Nations action, that's the Korean War. And so as you walk across the Army past, there's going to be 22 campaigns. They're all in the ceiling. And for those soldiers in the Army that wore those ribbons, well, they're represented in the ceiling here. And so you walk across from 1775 until the current day, our Army history, and it's displayed in the ceiling. Then after you move in from just a glance at the ceiling to this wall, this is a black granite wall. And look what we have here. Since the Revolution, to the lower right-hand corner, these are current wars, current missions that the Army is contributing or participating in. There's 190 190 streamers on the Army flag, and those individual locations are all listed up here on this wall. Special place for sure. Now we're looking again back at this platoon formation just a little differently, but it gives you a sense for a bit more detail. And as you think about the significance of this formation, we have people come in this museum and study every one of these stories. Now, when you look at these pylons, I mean, they're fixed today, and so you walk across this formation toward the back squads. The last two squads actually have a digital display. So on the backside, we rotate stories of soldiers, and so we're getting at hundreds and thousands of stories by way of the digital displays. But at the far end of this formation, there's the Soldier's Creed up on that wall, and you may not be able to see it from your individual screens, but I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights. The Soldier's Creed, it goes like this: I'm an American soldier. I'm a warrior, a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States, and I live the Army values. Okay, that's the introduction. That's the opening. And what I'm suggesting to you here is those words mean something special, something unique, something instructive about those meanings for a soldier. And so the Army values, we have 7, and we display the Army values all over our museum as a reminder for those particular words and the meaning of those words as you think about soldiers and their conduct. Okay, so this is the Soldier Story Gallery. Now, I'm going to take you back just a little bit as you think about the construction of the Army's museum at Fort Belvoir. Before we put up the steel, structural steel, obviously provides the framework for the building itself, but we had to bring in 4 macro artifacts: a French tank, top left. There's a landing craft in the left center there, and then there's a Bradley fighting vehicle in the lower left corner. And then there's a Sherman tank on the right in these photos. So we had to bring in each of these items of equipment on special platforms before we put up any steel. So that was one of the major steps in our construction process. Now I'm just going to give you, for sake of an introduction, just a couple of thoughts here about what we're going to see. And I just picked a slide or two from each of our galleries to introduce you to what's going on in the Army's National Museum. The first one is Founding the Nation. That's the Revolutionary War. Preserving the Nation is our Civil War in 1860s. Nation Overseas, World War I. Global War is going to be, that's the war in the Pacific and the theater. That's World War II, basically. The Cold War is a place that we introduced in a European setting. Now, this is after World War II. The Cold War is a time when we were convinced, or we, the United States and our Army in particular, were preparing for the Soviet Union to move from east to west. And that's going to be through Germany, through France, and so on. And so we introduced the Cold War with that setting, and we talk about the plans that all of our units practice routinely, and we display those graphically. Then that Cold War is then, introduction is followed by the Korean War. That's 1950, 53, and then the Korean War display is followed by the Vietnam War. So those 3 galleries then cover our Cold War period. So if you think November 1989, the wall comes down in Berlin, and you know the story from there. Following that period, and the last gallery is called Changing World. So if you think about the period 1990, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and all of our missions following that particular period of time, they're all on display in this gallery, and I'll talk about just a couple of those. We have a unique gallery that talks about Army and society, our Army and society, in a way that a lot of people don't think about Army in this regard. Right? People think the Army fights our nation's wars, which we do. But the Army, our Army, has contributed in a number of ways. A couple of highlights, and we can talk about them a little bit later. Communications, engineering, medicine, space, transportation. I mean, the list goes on about things that the Army, a neat story, and it's a way of connecting with the public, that perhaps exchanges some ideas that we didn't learn in school. So now we're in the Army corridor. You see the mule in the left center. That this mule is on a supply mission, and mules carrying ammunition. And in fact, from the Revolution even into the 1950s, we have Army missions that had mule-related transportation. Early on in Afghanistan, we had special operations soldiers, special operations units that rode horseback in very recent missions. And so that, in some respects, both the mule and horse really served a lot longer than many people even thought about or perhaps recall. So here we are, Army corridor, and I'm just going to take just a kind of a walkthrough of the galleries as a summary here. When our units first formed, they were artillery lacking for sure. And I'm talking about heavy weapons, infantry formations for the most part. And so what we have on display here is an example of a young book salesman from Boston, a guy named Henry Knox, who convinced General Washington that he could go, this is Knox now, up to Fort Ticonderoga, New York, and get weapons that they had captured from the British. And sure enough, that's what Knox did. Knox, just a young kid, 24 years old. So this expedition, we call it the Knox expedition, but he went to Ticonderoga, 300 miles, 60 tons plus, over some rugged terrain. I mean, on the display here, it looks like it's kind of the roads have been opened up. They cut their way through vegetation and trees, went across partially frozen lakes and water features. And it's an unbelievable story about logistics in the American Revolution. And Knox, sure enough, got those weapons. Every one of the weapons that they left Ticonderoga with, he ended up in Boston with those weapons. So we returned essentially the British weapons against the British in Boston. And the spring of '76, the British left town, just as a sample. Another thing we display here, General Washington was big on civilian control, but another thing that a lot of people don't realize, that one of the first things that our commanding general of our Continental Army did was receive congressional permission to put chaplains in our regiments. And the significance of chaplains and regiments as you think about kind of the mental stress that we apply to many, many scenarios in our military these days, and chaplains represent a piece of that strength for sure. Call this the preserving the nation. This is really the Civil War, but I want to tell you a story about Christian Fleetwood. You can see he's with a force of the U.S. colored troops. Christian later received the Medal of Honor, but I just want you to get a sense for why he joined in the first place, and that is abolish slavery and save my country. You could take those words however you like, but that's Fleetwood talking to us. Retired as a sergeant major, unbelievable record in the Civil War, and what he did following is a story all its own. You'll see the cannon here. This is a 12-pound cannon, Napoleon. So it's going to be a French weapon. And you see the soldiers around this cannon, these crewmen. We sent soldiers from the Army to New York City, and they held these positions. They stood these positions for a digitized image, then later created each of the images. So the soldiers you see in this museum, other than one, are all soldiers that are serving in the Army. But we do have a coastie. I'll show you that one in just a second. So that's preserving the Nation Gallery. Just a brief recap. We call this Nation Overseas, World War I period, and you'll see the doughboys here just secured a German artillery position here. I just want to tell you a quick story about the Meuse-Argonne campaign. This could be 1918 period here. And of course, the United States entered World War I late, reluctantly and very late. But one thing that General Pershing was determined to keep the American units together wherever he could. And so he pushed back pretty hard with the British and with the French to create units that were subordinate and responsible to American-led leadership. In Meuse-Argonne as a campaign, as an example, as I tell you this, it's the final offensive mission, World War I. And the American troops total 1.2 million participating in this campaign. Unbelievable contribution. A lot of people said it couldn't be done, and obviously over time, at a cost of 26 plus, almost 27,000 lost in that. These are killed in action in that campaign alone. Tremendous costs for sure, as we talk about this. One of the planners of the missions for General Pershing, a young major named George Marshall. And you know the story about General Marshall, but served in the 1st Division, and Pershing was convinced that young major could help plan the logistics, and they accomplished some things that even today are staggering to recognize in terms of the significance of. Okay, so that's World War I. This is just a introduction to the global war. And look at this tank. Well, it's the same tank you saw earlier that we dropped in there. Now, this is not just an M4 Sherman. This is Cobra King. So if you think, I'm going to take you back to December of 1944. The Germans have our 101st Division surrounded. And this tank is the first vehicle that linked up with American troops. Bastogne is the location. And so we have Cobra King proudly on display here. Notice overhead the B-17s. Of course, we have a big discussion with our Air Force friends. Suba, you'll enjoy this. I mean, for a while, the Air Corps was part of the Army until 1947, I say. And so B-17s overhead display here. And it's a phenomenal display as you just think about what happened in World War II, both Pacific and the European theaters. Unbelievable courage on display routinely here. So here's what's going on in this display in a little different perspective, and that is you'll see a soldier on the top left. That's an 82nd Airborne soldier. You'll see then Cobra King just adjacent to the soldier. But look at the troops coming down the rope ladder, and so from the big troop ships down the rope ladders into the landing craft, and the landing craft that I showed you earlier actually delivered soldiers to the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944. A classic story. It's this vessel is like one of 5, maybe 6 in the world that was actually at the beaches. There's some replicas and there's others around, but this vehicle's got some serious history. And so we talk with World War II vets who came down, listening very carefully. And one of the things they all tell me, boy, we were young. Primarily, he said most of us were less than 20 coming down that rope. Stark reminder for me about the significance of the courage and the sacrifice of those who have gone before us. Okay, I told you a quick story about the Cold War gallery, and here's the setting: Europe, Korea, Vietnam. That's the Cold War window. This is after World War II, and it's going to be up until really until 1989 when the Berlin Wall. Well, in that left-hand photo there, you'll see a command post. You'll see chairs just like we had in Europe back in the day. You'll see a red phone on the desk, and the red phone rings, and our troops never know if it's a practice or it's going to be a real event. And so we listen to soldiers serving back in those days that talk about that kind of experience as they went through those preparations to go to war. Never knew for sure. Any hour, day or night, these young kids were packed up and went out to their fighting positions. The Korean War in the center, you'll have stories about the Korean War and how unprepared we were. The U.S. response to the Korean War, to that attack by the North Koreans was Task Force Smith. Brad Smith led a task force. I want to know how many units Brad Smith had subordinate to him. This is like a battalion now. He had 2 infantry companies and an artillery battery. That's the U.S. response to the Korean War. You know the stories. The enemy pushed us all the way south to the Pusan perimeter, and we fought our way back north. General MacArthur and others obviously secured a significant piece of with the units in the West, but quite a story. Again, on display, courage of our American soldiers. Vietnam War, Sue was already told you I'm a Vietnam vet, but special place for me. It brings back some unbelievable memories about the courage of the young kids that I had the honor to serve with. See a helicopter in the background. It's a UH-1 Bravo. It's got weapons on it, but essentially that aircraft is the same platform that carried all of our troops around Vietnam. Quick story about Vietnam. The average infantryman in a year in Vietnam was in contact 240 days. Why does that mean something? Helicopter. You could go from one location to another and you are always in contact with the enemy. You see that soldier down there, lower left corner? I want you to get a closer look at that soldier. He's a corporal, 9th Division. He's a machine gunner, M60 machine gunner. And you can see he's carrying the load. You get up close to his face, you'll see he's sweating. And Vietnam was always, I don't know, I guess always more than 100. It was always hot. This soldier has extra ammunition. He's got extra water. He's carrying his rations on his back. He's got the full kit. Entrenching tools, he's got it all. And you look at that soldier's face, you'll see a certain amount of courage on display. You'll see a certain amount of commitment and dedication. Just classic. And I had the honor of serving beside soldiers like that my tour in Vietnam. Special people for sure. I'll tell you a quick story about Lieutenant Sharon Lane. Sharon Lane was the only Army nurse killed by hostile action in Vietnam. Sharon was in a Vietnamese ward, and she was determined to stay at that ward. And in spite of being encouraged by others, hey, Sharon, take a break. So when she wasn't working on one side of the hospital, she was on the other side of the hospital working. And one day, it's going to be June 69 now, 122 millimeter rockets came in, and the rockets were never necessarily always accurate. But in this case, Sharon was hit by one of those rocket fragments and killed as a result. A nurse from Ohio. When I go to the wall, I stop by and talk with Sharon. Okay. Changing World Gallery. This is going to be Berlin Wall. You'll see it there. It's a piece of the wall. And so 1990 until our current day is on display here in terms of Army missions. Then the right-hand side is a Bradley fighting vehicle. So this is the Bradley fighting vehicle that was part of the leading edge of the attack in 2003. And again, you'll see the soldiers there, but these are all soldiers who came from moles serving in our Army. Well, I mentioned Army and Society, and this is just a couple of things on display. And I'm introducing you to some of the features here in our museum. You see the first Army helicopter. I want to take you to April of 1944. First Lieutenant Carter Harmon, one of the few pilots in the Army. Of course, helicopters back in those days were rare. Harmon is like one of the only pilots in that particular area of operations. It's a Sikorsky. So if you think about Sikorsky today, Black Hawk today, that's the same aircraft manufacturer that was part of this first helicopter. So we have a pilot and a passenger, and Harmon flew missions to pick up downed airmen. And really the aircraft only had capacity for a pilot and a passenger. And Harmon went in there and picked those downed airmen up with 2 missions. And so he actually had 2 passengers in each of those missions. Now, what's the significance of what Harmon did? He's behind enemy lines, behind Japanese lines when this happened. Unbelievable story, and we learn more about that in our museum. So then you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see the first Army airplane. Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, 1903. I mean, you know the stories there. This is an Army Wright flyer, and the Army required that the fixed-wing aircraft that you see on display here have a seat for a passenger. when the Wright brothers first created that initial airplane, the pilot laid down on that lower wing. So it had to have a pilot and a passenger, had to fly at least 10 miles, had to fly 40 miles an hour. Those were the criteria from the Army to the Wright brothers. And you just think about what the Wright brothers did and the significance of that. Unbelievable story about how they introduced aviation to the world without any question. Okay, move to the lower right-hand corner. You see that 1918 Liberty truck? I'll take you back to the spring of 1919. A young colonel named Eisenhower went from Washington, D.C., he's a convoy now, from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And he did this in 2 months, 3,200 miles, 62 plus days. So why do we tell this story? Well, not that many years later, a General Eisenhower and later a President Eisenhower was instrumental in what we call our interstate highway system. And he took experiences from his 1919 mission and from his World War I days and from his World War II days, and was instrumental in creating our nation's interstate system. Okay. Well, I told you earlier about the strength in our differences. And, 1948, President Truman said, we're going to desegregate the military. And you've heard the stories. What's this mean? Well, number one, I'll tell you what it means. And that is this stuff is not automatic. It takes leadership, determination, and it takes a certain courage to say, okay, here's how we're going to do this. But it requires that we're willing to improve. And so that's the journey our Army's been on. And we tell you these stories in our Reflecting and Changing gallery. Oh, I'd mentioned earlier about General Washington just adamant about civilian control of the military. And so this is after 8 years of fighting. Essentially, this is going to be the spring of 1783, and the fighting is over. The British are still in New York. This is March of 1783 now. And Washington's senior leaders and some of his combat veterans, hardened by 8 years of fighting, are determined among themselves that they won't get a pension. They weren't going to be paid. I mean, any number of grievances, and these guys had it. And Washington, in a little theater in Newburgh, New York, convinced these subordinates to remain subordinate to civilian control. How about that for a feature? And it sets us apart to this day. It's part of it being inefficient. It's part of it being kind of rough around the edges some days. One of the things General Washington was determined is our military stay subordinate to civilians. Okay, just a last stop here, and then we'll get it to some time for questions, discussion. Experiential Learning Center, one of the things we do here is teach. We teach about science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We teach about geography here. We teach kids how to read a map, how to read high ground, how to translate a grid coordinate, 6-digit grid coordinate. And so for those that had time in the military, one of the things you do is early on learn how to read a map. So we teach all of these things. And in many respects, when you think of STEM or GSTEM in the case of the Army discussion here, many of these same discussions are what teachers are applying to their curriculum in school today. And so in an Army setting, we reinforce that set of curriculum. Standards of learning are all applied. I mean, it's this special place here. And so this is the training center now. Go through, if students come through here, this is all hands-on. You have to decide, you have to work together, you have to decide what you're going to do, make decisions, and so on. And then you come to the laboratory, and the laboratory is the place with the exams called the lab, but this is the test. What are you tested on? We're tested on everything you just learned next door. Strength and weakness. You walk down, teachers know where the applications need a little attention, and so on. And so that's the learning lab, and it's just a great place for school kids. Now, to give you a sense for our reach, we have kids come here from Florida, Ohio, California, all over the country to experience this museum. So, and in some respects, really, this is the first year that we've not had some COVID-related restrictions. So we've got a neat future here as we talk about educating others about our Army. Well, I'll wrap up here with just a couple thoughts on Medal of Honor wall. Every soldier in our Army that's received the Medal of Honor is etched on this black granite wall. Harris Davis, some of you may have heard his story. Vietnam vet, unbelievable performance, contribution, courage on display by that soldier in Vietnam, and just received his Medal of Honor just a few weeks back. And he's been to this wall. His name's not carved yet, but as soon as his name is carved, Colonel Davis will be here witnessing that experience. Medal of Honor recipients, they're humble. They're a humble lot, and they all talk about those around them more than they do their individual actions. Really a treat to get to know those people because they're special. Okay, Suba, that's the story. That's the journey. So we're back.
Suba, do you want to start with the questions? You want me to?
Go ahead, Trudy, take it off.
Okay. General, the first question we have kind of relates to the educational center, and they're asking if there are online databases that would be beneficial to genealogists or historians available either on site or through the website.
Great question. We just had a program very recently scheduled on genealogy, and so that one we're just cutting our teeth on the genealogy piece of this thing. So I have to wait for, I'm thinking, a couple of weeks before we know much more about that. In terms of the online applications, if you go to the Learning Center, for example, the teachers can take segments of those learning sessions in Fort Discover, for example, and they can teach them all right in their classroom. They don't have to come to the museum at all, but obviously you get a different appreciation for that experience as you think about the experience itself. So yes, you can do them online, and we're moving more into apps where students can come here and they're assigned missions. They have to respond and go and find certain features in the museum, and so teachers are taking pretty seriously their visit, as you know how important that is. Does that get to your question, Trudy?
I think it does, and I will just direct that guest to stay in contact with the website for more information about what could be available from that standpoint.
Yeah, great point.
Suba, you want the next one?
Yeah, it's more of a personal question. Actually, it's a good question. My mother was in the Army Air Corps during World War II. I have her uniform. It's in perfect shape. I also have a picture of her in it. She passed away years ago, and I would like to know if I could donate her uniform to the museum if you have this type of display.
I don't, but I'm going to give you a couple of parts of that answer. One is the Army has a little feature on the webpage, but I'd be glad to help the person connect with those in the Army to say, hey, might you have a need for this display? And it could be at the Army's National Museum, or it could be at any of the other museums, because across the country, the Army's got some great museums that may well need just exactly what she has for an offer here. So, Sue, you help me with the contact, and I'll help that person connect with the Army. It would be an Army curator decision, and so I don't mean to make this bureaucratic, but that's the part that they may need some help with. Okay,
it's a person named P. On the Q&A it says Pat. So if Pat, if you're listening, you heard the general's answer. So hope that helps you. One of the other questions was, sorry.
If we want, Pat can email the AARP state email address, and I'll put that in the chat, and then we can get that information to Roger too.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Raven. Why did they choose metal for the Army Museum?
Yeah, you can imagine the discussion. It's a great question. And the answer is it's a strength. It's a quality that takes very little maintenance, actually. We got a special material that's resistant to the atmosphere, to the Potomac River, to its I'm talking about an environment that has certain characteristics for some salt saline in the atmosphere. So strength, maintenance, and attention is part of what really guided them in terms of the display. But it also has to do with, there's a small team. This goes way back. That's why the question's great. And that is, okay, what's the outside of this museum look like? And I'm going to give you a quick story. The people say, wait a minute, buddy. You need to be reminded the Army doesn't run around shiny. The Army is dirty. We crawl in the mud. I mean, it's a tough piece of duty. And so the idea was reflection, strength as a piece of that quality, then get a material that we have on display there. But it's both a reflection and a strength.
Okay. Trudy, take the next couple.
Okay, I have one question. I think you may have addressed this, but I just want to make sure we covered base for this particular guest. And they're asking, is the Army Air Corps included and recognized in the museum?
Yes, and you know, Sue, as we talk about the Air Corps stories, 1947, the Air Force was created, and so we talk about the B-17s, and we talk about the Air Corps being part of the Army until 1947. But we're also sensitive to the Air Force history, and of course the Air Force will take themselves back to the 1900s and way before that. So it's kind of a fun story about this issue. But yes, we talk about the Army Air Corps, and we talk about the contributions of the Air Corps throughout our Army history.
Are there recordings from the soldiers from the red phone or other conversations?
There are recordings of soldiers throughout the museum. A number of stories are on display in the kiosks. In fact, we continue to capture video of the stories of our soldier all the time. And in the course of this, that's really the next step we're working on is how to document, kind of beyond the text displays, photographs, stories of soldiers, and video capture of these stories. So that's the video in terms of a complete display is next on the list, but we're working on just that point. So it's a great one.
This is a question my wife would ask because she loves paper. Are paper maps used in case systems go down?
Yeah. Yes. In fact, we're very close to Army Geospatial Center, and it's a great point. And I mean, my tour in Vietnam, we always had paper maps. Of course, digitization took over for many years now after that. But yes, I talked with Army Geospatial in the last 2 months, and I said, could I get a printed map for any place in the world? And they came back and said yes.
Oh. That is good.
Interesting. And one of our guests wants to know, is the first Wright Army airplane on display at the museum? Is it the original? Is it a reproduction?
Yeah, it's a reproduction. It's a precise reproduction. In fact, the aircraft we have on display is so precise. If we had it out on a field, you know, the Wright brothers took off on a ramp, but if they had the ramp and the appropriate takeoff gear, the aircraft we have would actually fly. Yeah, the first aircraft way back 1903, that one's on display at the Smithsonian. That's a rare guy, but they continue to improve that.
I saw you one in chat, Trudy. How did you guys obtain that cannon from the Napoleonic War?
Yeah, well, you see, we didn't. Our American Army, Continental Army, back in those days, they didn't have any weapons, and so a number of our weapons came from the French, or they came from the British captured weapons. And so when you think about the weapons, these are heavy weapons now, artillery mortars and so on. many of those big weapons came from the French. The cannon, that 6-pound cannon we have in the Founded Nation Gallery, that's a French weapon. The 12-pounder in the Civil War, that's a French cannon. And of course, then later on, the United States started to produce munitions at some of our major plants, and so yeah, it took a while, but most of them came from French.
A guest wants to know, is there a way to know before visiting the museum what information or displays you have about a certain unit and their participation in World War II or Korea?
Yeah, the web page is probably the best if you want to. I say that customer service has got a great access to the details about a particular unit or how we tell a story. So the web page is a good one. Customer service is a good one, just for sake of introduction. And of course, we tell detailed unit stories routinely there, and we do it by way of the tributes out on the promenade and by way of we do lots of podcasts and webinars and lectures with authors. I mean, that's how we really tell these stories is through a number of mediums.
Do honor flights visit the museum?
Yes, and what a treat it is to meet those veterans. Just spend time, just a classic experience, you know, from one soldier to Marines, for example. I mean, I met a Marine in the last month. That's a veteran of Iwo Jima. This is a rare experience, and he wanted to learn about the stories of our Army. But in the course of that discussion, I got to know him, and just classic stories about he spent his life teaching school. I said, how many courses in this high school did you teach? He said, everything. This is a Marine veteran, an unbelievable story. And so yes, honor flights. They come by the museum, and it's a real honor for us to have them participate.
Very good. Suba, before I turn the program back over to you, one question came in with regard to the recording of this program. And the answer to that is yes, we have recorded this program, and our participants will get a link to this recording in a follow-up email. And yes, that link can be shared. And with that, Suba, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Trudy. Is the Army Museum website, Roger, is as simple as armymuseum.gov, or like I know
It's you got a couple. The NMUSA, the THENMUSA.org, that's one, or armyhistory.org is another. And from those two, really, you can get to all of the web features that we're talking about.
Okay. Raven, could you put that in the chat?
And you know one thing, Suba, just one quick point.
Yes, sir.
We talk about controlling the visitors, and really the tickets in our museum, there's no cost to get in our museum. And the thought is, we just want to make sure that the flow of our visitors is appropriate. And so through the ticketing, we control how many are there at one time. That's the only reason for the tickets.
Right. I did get a lot of comments in the chat box about how family members have served, and want to thank you for this wonderful presentation today. A lot of great comments in the chat box about the information. One that especially got to me was she has a hard time traveling, and this was a great way for her to see the Army Museum. So you gave her a really good presentation for somebody that has a hard time traveling. We of course encourage everybody to come to the Army Museum, visit Northern Virginia, and go to the Army Museum and see it firsthand. But for those people who have a hard time traveling, this was a great way for you to see it. yeah, and a lot of thank yous. My father was in the Army as well as my husband, so a lot of accolades. I had one that served in the Air Force, served in the Navy, so we had all kinds of services come in today. So I'm glad to see that from all the services. And so anyway, let me get to my closing comments. I really like to thank our guest speaker today. I hope he's not one and done, that he'll join us again next year. And as a veteran, I want to thank you for your service, sir. We'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you'll see a link to a survey. Please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us. We'll also send this link in a follow-up email later today. On our Tuesday Explorers programs will continue next week. Next week will be the last one. It'll be April, sorry, my bad. Going back to April, 25th of April. It'll be the tour of the Marine Corps Museum. So join us for that at 3:00. And then please look at www.aarp.org/Tuesday Explorer for information. And then in the chat box, you'll see a link to register for upcoming programs. There will be one more this year in commemoration of Veterans Day. That'll be done on November the 14th. But we have some time for that. We'll get the information out. That'll be from the National Portrait Gallery. But again, we thank you, General Schultz, for coming on today, sharing your time with us and leading us through the Army Museum. We truly appreciate your time today. And again, thank you for everybody from across the nation joining us today. Thank you to my co-host Trudy, and thank you for Raven from Richmond for helping us out today. And until next time, folks, we encourage you to stay curious and keep exploring. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Thank you and welcome home.